And we're live in three, two, and welcome everybody to another episode of Planet Mullins podcast. And we're in season 3 right now. My guest today is a fantastic jazz historian who tells the story of jazz through his own eyes and personal experiences. He's probably the most accomplished jazz reviewer in the history of the genre. Please say hello to Mr. Scott Yanow, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, Scott.
Hey, Rob. Hey, thanks for having me. And yeah, you're too kind, but I'll accept the compliments.
Well, it's not really, when people ask me about jazz and my jazz career, I think it's pretty easy for folks to misunderstand about jazz and jazz writing because it's not really the most profitable thing economically, would you say?
Well, yeah, I'd rather, if I were a banker, I'd be earning a little more, I think.
Oh, probably a little more. Well, you've reviewed quite a few of my projects over the years and been a good friend for a long time. And now you have an amazing new book out. How many books have you written? Is this your 9th or 10th one?
Actually, my 12th one.
Okay. So I'm just a little behind. But this new book of Scott's is called Life Through the Eyes of a Jazz Journalist, My Jazz Memoirs by Scott Yanow. And, what was it that prompted you to write a 12th book?
Well, I always tell musicians that they should write their memoirs, especially if they've been around a while, because so many of them have had a lot of unique experiences and a lot of funny things have happened along the way and fascinating stuff. And if they pass on, they pass away, and then the stories get lost forever.
Right.
So, I could think of, a variety of artists who I've interviewed who I wish had written their own books. So, I've said this a few times, and my wife Dory said, well, why not write one of your own?
Yeah.
Because I've been lucky enough to see stuff for the last almost 50 years, a lot of different concerts, and had interplay and interaction with a lot of musicians, and just interesting and funny things that have happened along the way. So I thought, well, this way I'll save it for posterity.
I think it's fantastic that you took the time to do it. And for those of you out there that have never written your own book, you likely have no idea how much work it is to be a book author. I've got 5 books out, and they're mostly piano technical books, but it is a lot of work. And it's a lot of hours, and you've got to check, especially in your case, you have to check all these historical facts about when was Sonny Rollins born, and how many albums has he made, and that kind of thing. And I guess the internet probably assisted in you being able to do research for this, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it does help. You just have to make sure that the information's correct anyway. It's always good to check in 2 or 3 places.
Right.
For my memoirs, luckily since about the late 80s or so, I've listed pretty much all the concerts that I've gone to along the way and all the club experiences. In fact, in the book, at one point, one chapter, I just list everything I saw in 1995, and I was amazed, but that I got this, and just feel very happy that I got to see so many good performances, from many artists who are no longer around. But because I was going out 3 or 4 nights a week, so there's like 150 or so concerts that year, and
wow,
it's amazing.
Wow, and that's a lot of people to write about. Well, you put here in the book, a lot of interesting chapters, and 3 of your favorite interviews. Let's just talk about those, because these are all iconic jazz heroes, people that I've listened to. And the 3 of them, the only one that we still have with us, I think, is Maynard Ferguson, right?
No, but he's not around anymore.
Oh, not too. So let's start with the first one, Freddie Hubbard. Tell us about why was Freddie Hubbard one of your favorite interviews?
Oh, well, because he's one of the greatest trumpeters of all time. And at that time, he was with the Columbia label, and he was not too happy with the way he was being treated. So it made for a colorful interview. Actually, I interviewed him at Columbia's office in LA. And I always remember he walked into the room with a bottle of gin in one hand and a lit joint in the other. I mean, and it was lit, So,
well, the era of jazz and drugs and booze and all that stuff, it's kind of run a long time. But one of my students recently hired 4 Jazz Berkeley grads to be in her rock band, and they're all like, 25. Nobody ate meat, nobody drank liquor, nobody smoked weed. I was like, where do they get their character, or don't
I
they
know,
do
really.
anything bad at all? I mean, jazz is a how do you define the word jazz anyway? Isn't it the word jazz means to have sex or something? What's the origin of the term?
Well, actually, that was JASS, I believe, when I had sexual connotations. I think the word jazz really about 1910 or so just kind of meant pep. I was actually I think the first example of it being in print was in a review of a baseball game. And
Uh-huh.
they said the pitcher had pep, he had jazz, he had a jazz ball. I think that's actually where the first time it was in print. But
Wow.
and I think that's why, the word jazz as JASS, it only lasted a year or two, and then they decided to change it to jazz itself, JZZ.
They put the Z's on there. Well, when I was a kid, my mom was a huge fan of all of the big band and the early swing, and being interested in drums because I got a Buddy Rich album. I then got a Gene Krupa album. And then I saw there was this whole stigma about Gene Krupa because he had apparently smoked some marijuana, which was a new thing in 1940, whatever. And there were all these articles and the hubbub, and we're all going to die and he's going to hell. Do you remember that?
We did die, but it was like 40 years later. So.
You're right. But okay, well then, Chick Corea is another one of your great interviews, and I was lucky this year, a couple of months ago, to play on the last Chick Corea Hubert Laws collaboration, and that was a real honor for me and a big deal. And in fact, my arrangement of Lament that I recorded with Hubert that we did for Chick had my keyboards on there, so I have the strange distinction of being on a Chick Corea album playing keyboards before Chick Corea plays any notes on his own album, which is kind of weird. But I always thought of Chick as just kind of the iconic virtuoso and happy spirit. What was it like to talk to him in person?
Well, because his career was amazing, because you could come up with 100 really great Chick Corea records, or records that he's on, and that's only about half of them.
Wow.
He was he was the type of person who he would form a band, and then 3 months later he'd form another band and have another band after that. But he never broke up any bands, so he kept on coming back to his earlier groups and put together people in different combinations.
Right.
And he was like that for 50 years, and it's just remarkable. Every time I saw him, he was inspired, and I saw him maybe a dozen times with that many different groups. When I interviewed him, I was around 1978, I believe, and so I was just kind of starting out, and he was just so nice. He talked for an hour and a half. And it was supposed to be a short interview. He just talked about everything, answered all my questions. Why did Al Di Meola leave Return to Forever? I asked him questions like that. That could be a controversy, but he handled everything really nice. And then even after I shut the tape recorder off, he talked another hour.
Wow.
Like he had nothing else to do, which of course he's got dozens of projects, so he always had stuff.
Yeah.
So he was like, and he always was like that in concert too. He's just so friendly to the audience, and also I guess friendly to other musicians and just welcoming, and always wanted to hear what they had to say.
Yeah, he's probably one of the greatest ambassadors and communicators of the jazz genre. And in speaking with Hubert about Chick, those guys met all the way back in Juilliard in like 1961. And Hubert tells the stories of them having to bribe janitors to let them into the practice rooms to play jazz at Juilliard because it was illegal to play jazz at that school. They wouldn't allow it, that horrible stuff, that evil music. So
I know. Well, jazz has always had people trying to outlaw it, but that's
right.
pretty good.
Well, I thought that it was also interesting to hear Hubert just talk about Chick's genius, because his main comments about Chick whenever we'd be playing a gig, and then he was going to go play a gig with Chick. He'd be like, "Oh man, I was so looking forward to going to Japan for a week, and then Chick wrote all this new music, and none of it's playable. You can't play any of it on flute. I'm going to be in my practice in the hotel practicing the whole week while Chick is off having a good time." So, but yeah, Chick's passing was real serious, and it happened earlier this year, right? Did you do any write-ups about that?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, there's been a lot of tributes to him, but it just wasn't expected, really, because if someone's declining for a few years, then it's not that much of a surprise. But he was still playing great up until the end, really.
Yeah, and he had an online class that some of my students participated in too, and nobody had a clue that he was sick at all. So, okay, here's another one of your favorites, Maynard Ferguson. And for those of you that don't know who Maynard was, he was kind of the king of what we call the screech trumpet players, right, Scott?
Oh yeah, well he hit notes, say in 1950 that nobody had ever hit before, and he
On a
and he and
trumpet.
he stayed that way throughout his career. Really, he didn't really decline much. He didn't lose much of his range, although trumpeters got better and they were able to finally equal him. But yeah, he was pretty outstanding in that field. But he could also play jazz pretty well in the lower register and medium register. And he was also another one who was a really nice guy, and he was pretty humorous and always had witty things to say, and he just loved playing. He said that he never had any trouble hitting high notes even as a teenager. He just said that it apparently he had perfect breathing. He just had
Oh,
physically, he tried to analyze it at times, and he went swimming every day just to keep in shape on that. But
uh-huh.
swimming laps. But yeah, but he was just a nice guy, and he enjoyed. See, with a lot of these guys, I enjoy asking them questions that they're not asked before. So I had him talking about playing with Boyd Rayburn in 1949, and this was 30 years later, and
Right.
Charlie Barnett, and rather than just talking about Stan Kenton, which was he was a famous sideman for a while before he had his own band. But I asked him about playing with Jimmy Dorsey and those kind of things, and he enjoyed it. He had
Wow.
some good scares.
Well,
So those three interviews I put in the book just because they're my favorite ones from the Record Review days, which was a magazine I wrote for from about 76 to 84. So I figured those are vintage interviews nobody's seen since then.
well, yeah, before or since. I mean, one of the other things that I thought was interesting in here is that you talk a little bit about the guy who was kind of the previous jazz historian to the universe, Leonard Feather. And
Mhm.
Leonard and I actually were friends towards the end of his life. I met him at a thing called the Conference on World Affairs in Boulder, and he was highly opinionated about jazz and about electronic music and stuff like that. Were you and Leonard close at any point?
Well, I was never
Were you
really.
more like competitors?
No, not that you couldn't really compete with him. It'd be like someone trying to compete with Chick Corea, let's say. You're not really. If you're lucky, you could get on his level. But Leonard Feather had a 40-year head start, so there was no way I was going to catch him.
Well,
No, no, no. The thing about him is he was accessible. In LA, if you went to a jazz club or a concert, you could walk up to him, and there he is. With a lot of the critics didn't go out through the years, didn't go out to concerts all that much, and maybe if you tried talking to them, they wouldn't be that friendly. But he was usually open to things, so
uh-huh.
it was possible to know him a little bit, and I crossed paths with him because being in Los Angeles, and there were maybe about 5 or 6 critics at that time in LA. It was easy to come up to him.
Yeah, I have a silly, quick little story. I was at the old Catalina Jazz Club, the one off of Cahuenga, one night, and I'd gone there to see Dizzy Gillespie. And I was on a first date with a cute girl, and we were sitting at the second table back from the stage. I mean, those were really good seats. And there was a couple in front of me, and the man had on the gaudiest, most weirdest looking multicolored jacket. It was like Andrew and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And I was drinking that night, and I started telling jokes to this girl to impress her about how stupid that guy's coat was. And eventually the guy started getting bugged because he could overhear me. And Dizzy Gillespie comes out and says, "We want to welcome Leonard Feather to the audience." And the guy in the ugly coat stands up and it's Leonard. I was like, no, this is horrible. But one of the things that I just have always loved about you and the old Burbank house is that for decades you've had your own kind of a birthday party celebration. You've had all of the best players in jazz around LA and quite a few people from other places too at your birthday party that you started in 1976. Tell everybody about that. That's epic.
Well, back in '76, I knew about 20 different people, and they didn't really know each other. So I thought, well, be a great birthday present to myself just to have them all in the same room at the same time. So the first few from that, I had an annual birthday party, and sometimes it was twice a year, and it would be a jazz jam session, basically bebop, with a little Dixieland, a little swing, and then sometimes more hard bop, a little more modern. But basically, bebop was the foundation for it because we could just call out tunes and everybody could just jam together, and you have unusual combinations of people. Sometimes you have these great virtuosos, and sometimes people that are much more primitive, but it worked. And it also gave me an opportunity to play with a lot of really good players because they're not going to throw me out because it's my party.
I remember at several of those epic parties that you threw going out to your garage, and in your garage it was like a 2-car or 3-car extension to the house, and floor to ceiling on all 4 walls were jazz LPs, and they were all organized and alphabetized. And we used to try and you had the ping pong table. Mm-hmm. So, Tina and I would play ping pong out there and stuff. And then one of the fun things that maybe you might have not known that we would do this, but we would just, pick out an album from somewhere in the collection and walk over to you with the album and see what you could say about it. We're trying to stump you. And it wasn't ever possible to stump you, man.
Well, I do listen to everything. That's the key. And of course, the CDs are actually overwhelming the LPs at this point. But
wow. Well, how many jazz albums do you have on hands? Do you count them? How many are there by now?
Well, if you combine them together, CDs and LPs, I'm getting close to 64,000.
Wow, man, that's incredible.
So the LPs are around 20,000. So it shows you the CDs are like 44,000. But I'm not complaining, no, because it's always been my goal to, and it's an impossible goal, but it's a fun one to try for, is to get every good jazz record ever made and actually have a chance to hear everyone.
That's
so I'm always going to be short, but it's fun.
Well, that's cool too. What I think is just so interesting is that over the course of our lifetimes, there seems to be a cyclical thing where some other kind of music will come into fashion, and then there's this whole crowd of people that come out with the jazz is dead thing. Mm-hmm. And then it never dies, though. It just always somehow it just springs up in Indiana, or I don't know, Springfield, Missouri or something, or Kansas or Missouri, like Pat Metheny or Lyle Mays out of Wisconsin. It's like, boom, here they are. It's just they keep dropping into our universe doing amazing stuff. Isn't that wacky?
Well, I ran across an article a while ago from 1923 that claimed that jazz was finally dead.
Finally,
yeah, Dad, after 10 years. So no, that people, it's like every 5 years or so, jazz is dead. What's not dead? I think right now, throughout the world, there's more talented jazz musicians than any time in its history.
Oh, okay.
Well, as far as the number goes. Now you might say, oh, there's no Duke Ellington, there's no John Coltrane, but it doesn't matter because there are other people that have moved the music forward. And it's just that it's a little more difficult to follow because, say in the 50s and 60s, you had maybe 6 or 7 main record labels, and you could just hear, oh, here's the new records and here's what's happening now. Now
Right.
you have hundreds. Now you have people releasing their own records, and they're not just playing in New York, they're playing all over the world. So there might be some tremendous trombonists from Finland, and it's going to take us a few years to discover them. But the music is moving forward, and it's very healthy. Very healthy. You know, it might not be healthy commercially. It might be hard for people to make a living in certain spots. They have to be very creative. But artistically, you know, the music is doing well. Every style exists from the past. It's all being played by somebody,
Uh-huh.
and people are mixing together styles and coming up with their own voices. So I'm not worried about the future of jazz, really.
Uh-huh. Well, that's interesting as a commentary, because for some reason, you know, me being a part of the Recording Academy, I've just watched the visibility and the exposure granted to jazz mostly drop during the time that I've been a part of the Academy. And what was really encouraging this, oh, I'm starting to lose the bottom part of your face, Scott, if you
Oh,
can
I'm
move.
sorry, there
Move
I
your device a little bit. What I thought was really interesting is at the end of the Grammys this year, not only did they have a jazz big band thing happening, I think it was with Lady Gaga, but they also had um, a music teacher award, and that was in the last 20 minutes, the most prime time of the whole show. So I took that to be an encouraging sign, you know, that the Grammys are kind of getting back more into supporting it. And it, but what they told me when I was a kid, you can say what they told you. We had a guy come to high school to the music department. I was at Lincoln High, and I was already had my own jazz group and stuff. And so we were all asking this guy on career day, well, what advice would you give us? And he said, never, never become a musician. Like, that's the worst possible thing you could ever do. So did you become a writer because you didn't want to become a musician, or did you try and do both things, or why did you even get into this?
Well, you know, it's a cliche usually by musicians who might have gotten a bad review recently that writers are frustrated musicians. But if you hear most of them play, they're actually frustrating musicians. Now,
uh,
now in my case, I'm not, you know, I played, you know, I play on an amateur level. I play saxophone, clarinet, and I always say I'm the world's greatest melodica player because there aren't any.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
basically. But no, I was a jazz fan first, and still a jazz fan, really, or a jazz fanatic. And I was writing about the music actually a little bit before I started playing anything. And I just played because, you know, I loved, because it's fun. Basically, for me, I never tried to make a living from it. I probably made total of $500 my entire in the last 50 years from playing music. So
wow,
so no, it was never really that. I do think that when writers play music a little bit, you know, it's good because it gives them more knowledge, and the more knowledge, the better. But you don't have to be a musician to be a jazz critic, really.
well,
But what you have to do is love the music, and I would say if you could write in coherently and complete sentences, then you're qualified. You know,
right.
there's no real degree for it. You know,
Oh,
the key is to keep it interesting, because to me it's the greatest music in the world. It's the most creative, because, you know, what other kind of music does someone go on stage and create it before in front of people? You know,
yeah,
to a certain extent, with country and pop and, you know, R&B and even blues, you know, it's kind of set. There's a certain, you know, way that in some cases they want to recreate the record, or maybe they're stretching out, but it's kind of restricted. You have to stick to real tight to the songs. In jazz, you could just go out there and play, make it up off the top of your head sometimes.
right. Yeah. Well, there were artists out there that I had trouble following when I was younger, and they were kind of the yo guys from New York City. One of them being, you know, Sun Ra and the orchestra, and then George Russell, who I studied with. He had a big band where he would just, you know, put in front of a saxophone player, play these three notes from start to finish, but
Uh,
not play the other nine notes. And then, of course, you know, the famous example is Ornette Coleman, who is just kind of like a stream of consciousness melodic
Mhm.
player, but I never really related to those guys because they were just a little too far out for me, and I was more into the mainstream stuff. But once electricity got involved in the actual instruments, I mean, that was a huge change that happened. And I remember some of the record company people and festival people were really upset that there was, now we have fusion and Chick Corea is playing a Rhodes, and Keith Jarrett and Chick are both in Miles's band with Zawinul, and he's on a Rhodes, and Miles is using a wah wah pedal. And what does the world come to? Yeah, right.
Well, it's up to the musicians to really determine the music, that, and if the audience doesn't like it, just don't see it. But, that's the thing about jazz. It's the money is not supposed to be the main issue. The main issue is just being creative and developing your own voice. And you could play in an older style creatively. You could play 1920s jazz and be creative in the solos you have and the way you present the music. So, that's probably one of the main things a jazz critic has to do is be open-minded towards it all and try to at least get an idea of what the musicians are trying to do.
Well,
And to me, as long as it's colorful and as long as it's nice if it has some wit, a little bit of humor in it. But basically, if it's boring, then it kind of fails. And if it's colorful, then it succeeds. And that's
uh,
kind of how I look at it.
well, I've always felt grateful in your reviews of my stuff that you notice that I put little humorous things into my improvs and into my compositions, because
Mhm.
having a sense of humor is really important if you're going to try and be a musician of any kind. I think especially a jazz musician. And for a few of my records, I wanted to be sure that at some point, somewhere on the record, I played Mary Had a Little Lamb for 2 bars.
Oh,
I just had to have, I then I went from that to the ba dee da 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 Close Encounters theme. And
oh yeah.
so we would stick these little things in there to see if people were paying attention or not. But you get somebody like Thelonious Monk, and I didn't know him, of course, but he just seems to have just an amazing kind of wit and sense of poking fun at stuff in his music. Did you find him that way?
Oh yeah. Well, I loved his solo pieces when he'd go into stride piano a little bit, but it was his version of stride. So he's showing, oh, this is what James P. Johnson sort of sounded like, but leaving out half the notes and putting in these other ones. And yeah, I mean, there was definitely humor in him. I mean, not everybody has to have humor. I mean, I don't think there's any humor in Coltrane's recordings at all. He's
Right.
just always so serious. But the key is to show your personality and have it be lively and have it be because you're reflecting life and you're reflecting your own life.
Yeah, I found I felt like Coltrane towards the end was playing more out of anger or anguish, is how it affected me. I mean, I respected everything that he did musically, compositionally, and the bebop eras, and him going further and further out. But by the time he was doing those very last records, I think they were on Atlantic, I couldn't really listen to that stuff because the feeling of it was, it just made me not feel good.
Well, it's hard to say what he was really thinking. I mean, it's kind of sound explorations in a way. It's like breaking the sound barrier, sort of like what Hendrix would do in rock. It's just
Right.
coming up with new sound and stretching it to the point where is it music or is it noise or is it you know? But unfortunately, with Coltrane and also with Hendrix, but Coltrane especially, he didn't live long enough to really resolve it. What would he be doing in 1970? I don't know. That's the problem. A
Right.
few years after he passed, that he might have gone in a different direction.
That's it. It was.
But I think I think he was just stretching the music really.
Uh,
And yeah, some of it's hard to listen to for people after his last year or so. But well, it's part of the history. So
right. Well, what an amazing career that he had, and in teaching some of my students um, who are fans of him and fans of McCoy Tyner and fans of Coltrane's group, I point out to them, excuse me, on a lot of the recordings, the large gaps in the songs where there is no keyboard playing.
Mhm.
And from what I had heard, like if Coltrane was feeling restricted by the keyboardist, he would just kind of tell him to, go to the bathroom or take a break or lay out. And, that happened with McCoy a few times, and it happened several times with Thelonious Monk. But on the Monk things, I don't know if it was Monk just being wacky and standing up and dancing in his little circular dance that he did, or if Coltrane was actually saying, hey man, cool it, because Coltrane was so far ahead of everybody harmonically for his time, but it was still recognizably, um, you know, intervals and scales and theory concepts that I understood. And when it was Ornette Coleman, I just never did get it. I just, and who was the other guy? Cecil Taylor.
Well, yeah, in Cecil Taylor's case, the same thing. It's breaking the sound barrier. It's like pushing it to the extreme. You can't really play more extreme than Cecil Taylor, because it's like listening to a thunderstorm sometimes.
Yeah, wow.
It becomes a different kind of music, really. But he's playing the piano like the drums sometimes, and so it can, if people are not really into his music, I certainly understand. I'm just grateful whenever people are into some period of jazz, some type
Right.
of it. His music wasn't really made to be played on the hit parade anyway.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the hit parade, one of the more controversial things that happened in the last 30 or 40 years was the advent of smooth jazz and the iconic kind of face of smooth jazz, Kenny G. And I got caught in that crossfire in my own career because I enjoyed playing synthesizer and electric piano and incorporating rock beats into my music like I did on the Red Shoes album and on the Fifth Gear album and stuff like that. But we were still calling it contemporary jazz because there were large improvisational sections in the songs where people could stretch out. There were long songs. And then all of a sudden, here comes Kenny G with this, I guess a lot of people called it a milk toast or kind of a vapid approach to jazz. And how do you see the contribution or detriment of Kenny G to the whole genre and history of jazz music?
Well, I don't really think of him as jazz. I think of him more as instrumental pop because he's not really improvising all that much. And all right, his tone, I don't care for, but some people love it. It's okay, and he's a decent musician. I mean, he proved that early on when he played with Jeff Lorber.
Right.
But it's like, to be a jazz musician, you have to want to play jazz. That's one of the prerequisites. And he's just playing pop music. So he's playing stuff that he could get a big audience with, and the audience isn't necessarily a jazz audience; they're a pop audience to a large extent. So, and a lot of the smooth jazz, it depends on the musician itself. Some of them are purposely playing much simpler than they normally would. They're not, they're doing it for the money. Other ones, that's how they play. So I just kind of ignore the whole genre. I just call it smooth. I don't even call it smooth jazz generally. It's a different kind of music,
Instrumental pop, I think, is a good kind of generic term for that. And not really knowing Kenny, but seeing him in a few of my early gigs in LA, he was just always a super nice guy to me. And then I've known his bass player, Vale Johnson, for more than 30 years. And especially when Kenny was at that peak thing where he was actually playing stadiums.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're thinking about that, for me, I wasn't all the way against what Kenny was doing. Like Metheny came out and just like railed against Kenny really bad in these classic interviews that are still out there. But Vale and I would talk about it. And Vale's point that I could really see was that, hey, here's a guy who is popularizing music that's mostly without a singer. So anybody that wants to be an instrumentalist can take pride and have hope that maybe they can one day fill an arena playing instrumental music, which is usually unheard of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of, Queen without the vocals, that's not going to fill Wembley. You know what I mean? But did you have now? There's so much to cover here. I don't know how we're gonna cram it all into the time we've got today. But do you have who are some of your favorite singers? Like I really like Ella, and I like Nina Simone, and I think they've still got big followings. But who are some of your favorite female vocalists?
Well, of all time, I think to me, Ella is number one, and Sarah Vaughan's a close second. As far as the female singers go, because that it's like no one can even compete with them. Really, they're just on their own level. But there are many that I like. From the past, they say Anita O'Day was great, and from the current ones, there were. Roberta Gambarini is really good. This is among the singers who are still around today. She's a great bebop singer.
Oh,
Veronica Swift is an up and coming singer who's very good. Also, also kind of bop oriented. And I always like Karen Allison. And
oh yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's quite a few. Now, when it comes to male singers, there's been a shortage for about 40 years, really. I mean, I even talked about that in the late 90s. I mean, at that point in time, after Joe Williams and Mel Torme passed away, it was Mark Murphy, and that was about it, really. And now it's Kurt Elling. He's number one. Gregory Porter's probably number two.
Okay.
Beyond that, then it gets difficult because then you have a certain amount of singers who are good, but they're not necessarily on that level, really.
Right.
And of all time, well, Louis Armstrong's my favorite musician anyway. So I always loved his singing. And from the past, the male singers, Jimmy Rushing, and like I say, Joe Williams and Mel Torme, and those are among the best ones to me.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And I of course liked Nat King Cole a lot. And what was
Oh yeah.
what was so funny to me though is that as I got older in music and I started to understand more about how the business machine works in music, that I started seeing, oh, every 10 years they invent a new 20-year-old or early 20s version of Sinatra. It's like every 10 years we get another one of those.
I know.
And I think isn't the current one Michael Bublé? Is he the current one of that?
Yeah, although he's been around for a little while too. He's pretty good, but I'm still, in his case, I wait for him to be a little more original. He kind of sounds like Bobby Darin a little to me too, but it's a mixture of that and Sinatra.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, well, of course, when it comes to music business, they just want to make money. So, they look at the past, they want to get the new Ella and the new Oscar Peterson and the new anything that they can really find.
Yeah.
But that's to be expected. It's up to the musicians to keep it, creative.
Well, I've always been fascinated with just the ease and the confidence that Oscar Peterson could play with while blazing at these ridiculous tempos, along with Joe Pass. I was talking about Oscar with one of my students earlier today, telling him to check out some of his recordings because the guy could do stride left hand like nobody's business and then play these amazing runs on the top of it. And even without a drummer at 240 beats a minute, with him and Joe Pass and Orsted Pedersen on bass, those were some amazing records, man.
Yeah, well, Oscar Peterson's, any list of great jazz piano players puts him in the top 3 or 4 anyway.
Right.
It's really hard to top him. And he could outswing anybody, in any tempo, really.
Get out swing. But now, what is the difference between swing and other kinds of rhythmic feels, just for the layman out there? Like, can you describe that?
Well, to me, the swing is when the bass or maybe the piano, just plays it right on the beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 throughout. That swing where if it's funk or if it's a little more modern, well, then the bass lines are a little more danceable, and it really has to do with the bass more than anything else, I think, because you could play the same saxophone solo in a swing or a funk setting and probably get away with it if the chords are there. But what the bass or the bass lines, that's really how it is. So you're tapping your foot to it, it's probably swing. And if you're kind of dancing to it, then it's probably funkier, really.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting perspective on it, because from the music teacher perspective, and I take students at a lot of different levels, I always break down the straight eighth note and the swung eighth note by saying the bass line to Every Breath You Take by the Police is a straight eighth note. Don't, where all the equal lengths in the notes. And the Mickey Mouse theme is the swing eighth note. Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
And my buddy Mike Marlier, who's the head of the Lamont School of Music percussion program in Denver, he's got a funny way of it. He says, well, you're gonna make all your money in the music industry playing straight eighth notes and have all your fun playing swing eighth notes. It's just kind of a good comment. So anyway, what is the outlet for picking up this amazing book? And it looks like it's a few hundred pages, like basically about 300 pages with appendices, 60 jazz books everyone should have, artists of the past, the future, typical month in your life, the all music guide. I'm going to read about that because I hate those guys. Because they never got my discography right. But your book is now, how long has your book been out for anyway?
A couple weeks. So it just started out, and it's available from Amazon.com, which is great because it's available around the world. So I've been selling it, to some people have written to me in Europe, and they've enjoyed it. So I don't have to worry about shipping to them, and they don't have to worry about it taking months to get to them.
Yeah, that's really exciting too.
And the price is reasonable. So it's, like I say, it was just mostly stories that I wanted to get down that might have otherwise gotten lost. And a lot of incidents. I mean, it's a story about me growing up a little bit and telling, how I got involved in the music, really.
It's fantastic, man. Well, book number 12 by the world-renowned jazz journalist and historian, Scott Yanow. Scott's been my guest today on the Planet Mullins podcast, and I wish you always continued success. And I was so bummed when COVID shut down those annual birthday jams of yours, because the last couple of years we haven't been able to do it. But
coming back in October.
It's coming back in October, and I'll be happy to make the drive out there and to see you guys and fraternize with all the other LA jazz dudes. And I'm super happy for you, Scott. So I'll be reading through the book and have it in my bookshelf. And folks, you should pick it up too. It's Scott Yanow, and the title of the book is Life Through the Eyes of a Jazz Journalist. If you're into jazz, this is the most important book you can get since Leonard Feather's Encyclopedia of Jazz. And Scott, if somebody wants to reach out to you for a review or to talk to you, what's the best way for them to hit you up? Is it Facebook or email or what?
Oh, email is always good. If anybody wants to communicate with me, they could always send a note to scottyannowjazz@yahoo.com.
Okay.
And I want to say congratulations on having your 40th record recording. That's pretty good. And I've heard about 27, and I like them all. So
that's great, man. Yeah, 40 is quite a milestone, man. I'm surprised more than anyone else that I'm still here and able to be doing this. So always great to see you. Hope to see you at a show soon. And thanks again for coming on the show, Scott.
Sure. Thanks for having me. You take care.
Take care.